Marcus had always been different from other children. At 12 years old, he possessed an unusual combination of fearlessness and curiosity that often got him into trouble. Growing up in the bustling city of London, he lived with his grandmother Sarah in a small flat near Buckingham Palace. His parents had died in a car accident when he was 7, leaving him in the care of his elderly grandmother, who worked as a cleaner at a nearby hotel. Every morning, Marcus would walk past the palace gates on his way to school, watching the red-coated guards standing perfectly still like statues. He was fascinated by their tall black hats, their shiny boots, and most of all, the rifles they carried. The boy would often stop and stare, imagining what it would be like to hold such a weapon, to stand so straight and proud, to be part of something so important and historic. His grandmother Sarah often warned him about getting too close to the palace. "Those guards are not toys, Marcus," she would say while preparing his breakfast. "They are real soldiers with real weapons. You must respect them and keep your distance." But Marcus was a curious boy, and curiosity often overpowered caution in his young mind. At school, Marcus struggled to fit in with his classmates. He was smaller than most boys his age, with unruly brown hair and clothes that were clearly secondhand. The other children often made fun of him for living with his grandmother, and for not having the latest toys or gadgets. This made Marcus feel invisible and unimportant, which only increased his fascination with the palace guards who seemed so powerful and respected. One particular Tuesday morning in October, Marcus was walking to school when he noticed something unusual. One of the guards appeared to be younger than the others, perhaps nervous as he kept shifting his weight slightly from foot to foot. The rifle in his hand seemed less steady than those of his colleagues. Marcus stopped walking and studied the guard more carefully. The guard's name was Private James Wellington, though Marcus didn't know this at the time. James was indeed new to the job, having completed his training just 3 weeks earlier. At 19 years old, he was still adjusting to the responsibility of guarding one of the world's most famous landmarks. The weight of the rifle, the scratchy uniform, and the pressure of standing perfectly still for hours at a time were all still challenging for him. Marcus noticed that Private Wellington kept glancing around nervously, unlike the other guards who seemed to stare straight ahead with unwavering focus. There was something almost human about this guard that made him seem less intimidating than the others. In Marcus's 12-year-old mind, this guard seemed more approachable, more like a regular person than a military statue. As the days passed, Marcus began paying special attention to Private Wellington during his morning walks. He noticed that the guard always seemed relieved when his shift ended, that he would sometimes wipe sweat from his forehead despite the cool autumn weather, and that he appeared to be fighting to stay awake during the long hours of standing guard. Marcus began arriving at the palace gates earlier each morning, creating a routine of watching the guards change shifts. He learned their schedules and began to recognize the different personalities, even though none of them ever moved or spoke while on duty. But Private Wellington remained his focus because he seemed the most human, the most real. The boy's grandmother, Sarah, began to worry about his obsession with the palace guards. She noticed that Marcus was leaving for school earlier and earlier each morning, and she suspected he was spending too much time near the palace. When she asked him about it, Marcus would just shrug and say he liked watching the soldiers. "They're not a show, Marcus," Sarah would remind him gently. "They have an important job protecting the queen and the palace. You shouldn't treat them like entertainment." But Marcus couldn't explain to his grandmother that watching the guards made him feel connected to something bigger than himself, something important and meaningful. At school, Marcus's grades began to suffer as his mind wandered to thoughts of rifles, uniforms, and standing guard. His teacher, Mrs. Henderson, noticed his lack of attention and called his grandmother for a meeting. During the meeting, Mrs. Henderson explained that Marcus seemed distant and distracted, often staring out the window instead of focusing on his lessons. Sarah promised to talk to Marcus about his school performance, but when she tried to discuss it with him that evening, he seemed more interested in asking questions about the palace guards. "Grandmother, do you think they ever get scared holding those rifles? Do you think they ever wish they could move around or talk to people?" These questions worried Sarah because they suggested that Marcus was thinking too much about the guards, perhaps even identifying with them in some unhealthy way. She decided to change their morning routine, walking Marcus to school herself to ensure he didn't spend time lingering near the palace gates. However, Marcus was a determined boy. When his grandmother started walking him to school, he began leaving even earlier, telling her he needed extra time to prepare for classes.
In reality, he was using this time to continue his observation of the guards,
particularly Private Wellington. On the morning that would change everything, Marcus noticed that Private Wellington looked especially tired and stressed. The guard's usually straight posture seemed slightly slumped, and his eyes appeared unfocused. Marcus, in his childish logic, began to worry that the guard might drop his rifle or fall asleep on duty, which could get him in serious trouble. In Marcus's 12-year-old mind, he began to form a plan that he thought was helpful. He decided that if he could somehow get the guard's attention, maybe even help him stay alert, he would be doing a good deed. He didn't understand the serious nature of his thoughts or the potential consequences of interfering with a royal guard's duties. The stage was set for an incident that would shock everyone involved and teach a young boy lessons about respect, responsibility, and the difference between good intentions and dangerous actions. The morning of November 15th started like any other for Marcus. He woke up early, dressed quickly in his school uniform, and told his grandmother he needed to leave for school preparations. Sarah, still concerned about his recent behavior, reminded him to come straight home after school and to stay away from the palace gates. Marcus nodded and promised, but his mind was already focused on Private Wellington. For the past week, he had noticed that the young guard seemed increasingly tired and distracted. Yesterday, Marcus was certain he saw Wellington's eyelids drooping during his morning shift, and this worried the boy tremendously. In his 12-year-old logic, Marcus had convinced himself that he needed to help the guard. He imagined terrible consequences if Wellington fell asleep on duty. Maybe he would be fired or worse, sent to prison. Marcus didn't want to see the guard get in trouble, especially since Wellington seemed like the nicest and most human of all the royal guards. As Marcus approached the palace gates that morning, he noticed the usual crowd of early morning tourists taking photographs and admiring the guards. The tourists always maintained a respectful distance, staying behind the barriers and following the unwritten rules about not disturbing the soldiers on duty. Private Wellington was indeed tired that morning. He had been up most of the night studying for a military examination, and the lack of sleep was making his shift particularly difficult. The rifle felt heavier than usual in his hands, and he was fighting hard to maintain the perfect posture and unwavering attention that his position required. Marcus positioned himself at his usual observation spot, about 20 feet from the guard post. He watched Wellington carefully, noting every small sign of fatigue. When a gust of cold wind made the guard shiver slightly, Marcus felt sympathy for him. When Wellington shifted his weight almost imperceptibly to ease the strain on his legs, Marcus interpreted this as a sign that the guard was struggling. The boy began to move closer to the barrier, drawn by his desire to somehow help or encourage Wellington. The other tourists paid no attention to Marcus, assuming he was just another curious child interested in the famous guards. They had no idea what was forming in his young mind. As Marcus moved closer, he began to notice details about Wellington's rifle that he had never seen before. The weapon looked heavy and impressive, with intricate metalwork and a polished wooden stock. In Marcus's imagination, holding such a rifle would make him feel powerful and important, just like the guards themselves. An idea began to form in Marcus's mind, an idea that would have horrified any adult who understood its implications. He reasoned that if he could somehow take the rifle from Wellington's hands, even for just a moment, he could help the tired guard rest his arms. He could hold the weapon steady while Wellington caught his breath or regained his composure. The plan seemed perfectly logical to Marcus. In his childish understanding, he would be doing a favor for someone who looked like they needed help. He didn't comprehend the serious security implications, the potential danger, or the fact that touching a royal guard's weapon was strictly forbidden and could be considered a serious crime. Marcus spent several minutes working up his courage. He watched the other guards to make sure they weren't looking in his direction. He observed the tourists to ensure none of them were paying attention to him specifically. He studied Wellington's grip on the rifle, trying to figure out the best way to approach and take hold of the weapon. Private Wellington, despite his fatigue, was still alert enough to notice a young boy moving closer to his position. However, he assumed Marcus was just another curious tourist child who would eventually move on or be called away by parents. Wellington had been trained to ignore minor distractions and to maintain his focus regardless of what was happening around him. The morning sun was getting stronger, and more tourists were beginning to gather. Marcus realized that if he was going to act on his plan, he needed to do it soon before the area became too crowded. He took several deep breaths, trying to summon the courage for what he thought was a helpful gesture. Marcus began to move around the barrier, his heart beating rapidly with nervous energy. He convinced himself that what he was about to do was right and helpful. In his mind, he was being brave and kind by helping a tired soldier who clearly needed assistance. The boy approached Wellington from the side, trying to stay out of the guards' direct line of sight. He had watched the guards long enough to know that they were trained to look straight ahead and not to turn their heads unless absolutely necessary. Marcus used this knowledge to his advantage as he crept closer to the unsuspecting guard. Other tourists in the area were busy taking photographs and talking among themselves. None of them paid attention to the small boy who was moving with surprising stealth toward one of the most heavily guarded locations in London. If they had noticed Marcus's approach, they would have immediately realized that something inappropriate was about to happen. Private Wellington felt a slight movement near his position, but attributed it to the normal flow of tourists around the guard post. His training had taught him to remain focused and not to react to minor disturbances unless they posed a clear threat. A small boy approaching didn't register as a significant concern in his tired mind. Marcus was now within arm's reach of the rifle. His heart was pounding so loudly that he was certain everyone around him could hear it. He reached out his small hand toward the polished wooden stock of Wellington's rifle, still believing that he was about to perform a helpful act. The moment Marcus's fingers made contact with the rifle, everything changed. Wellington immediately felt the unauthorized touch and began to react according to his training. The other guards, who had been trained to watch for exactly this type of security breach, started to turn their attention toward Wellington's position. Tourists nearby began to realize that something unusual was happening. Cameras that had been pointed at various guards suddenly swung toward Wellington and Marcus. The peaceful morning atmosphere at the palace gates was about to be shattered by an incident that no one could have predicted. Marcus, still not understanding the gravity of what he had done, began to pull on the rifle, trying to take it from Wellington's grip. He was surprised by how heavy the weapon was and how firmly the guard was holding it. What he had imagined would be a simple, helpful gesture was turning into a struggle that would have consequences far beyond anything his 12-year-old mind could have imagined. The moment Marcus's hands gripped the rifle, Private Wellington's training kicked in with lightning speed. Despite his fatigue, years of military discipline took control of his actions. Wellington's first instinct was to secure his weapon, but he immediately realized that the person trying to take it was just a child, not a terrorist or criminal. The scene unfolded in what seemed like slow motion to the horrified tourists watching nearby. Marcus, still believing he was helping, tugged at the rifle with surprising determination for such a small boy. Wellington, torn between his duty to protect his weapon and his reluctance to harm a child, found himself in an impossible situation. "Let go," Wellington whispered urgently, breaking his ceremonial silence for the first time in weeks. His voice was sharp but not unkind, more concerned than angry. But Marcus, now committed to his misguided mission, held on tighter. The boy had convinced himself that the guard was just being polite by refusing help, and that persistence would eventually make Wellington understand his good intentions. Other guards around the palace perimeter immediately noticed the commotion. Sergeant Major Thompson, a 30-year veteran with steel-gray hair and countless years of experience, was the first to respond. He approached swiftly but carefully, understanding that the situation required delicacy rather than force. The tourists nearby began to react with a mixture of shock and fascination. Cameras and smartphones appeared from everywhere, capturing every second of the unprecedented scene. Some visitors gasped and covered their mouths in horror, while others seemed almost excited to witness such an unusual event at the normally peaceful palace gates. Marcus suddenly realized that his simple plan had created much more attention than he had expected. The whispers and camera clicks from the growing crowd made him understand that something was very wrong, but instead of letting go of the rifle, his panic made him grip it even tighter, as if holding on could somehow make the problem go away. Private Wellington was now facing the most challenging moment of his young military career. His training told him to never allow his weapon to be taken regardless of circumstances. But his common sense and basic humanity told him that this was clearly a confused child, not a genuine threat to security. "Please, son, you need to let go right now," Wellington said softly, his voice barely audible to anyone except Marcus. The guard's face had gone pale with stress, and beads of sweat were forming on his forehead despite the cool morning air. Sergeant Major Thompson reached the scene and immediately assessed the situation. His experienced eyes took in every detail: the frightened but determined look on Marcus's face, the confusion and concern in Wellington's eyes, and the growing crowd of onlookers who were documenting everything with their cameras. "Step away from the guard, young man," Thompson commanded in a firm but not harsh voice. His tone carried the authority of decades in the military, but also the wisdom to know that shouting at a scared child would only make the situation worse. Marcus looked up at the imposing figure of Sergeant Major Thompson and felt his resolve beginning to crumble. This was clearly not going according to his plan. The helpful gesture he had imagined was turning into a nightmare scenario with more adults and more attention than he could handle. But fear often makes people do irrational things, and Marcus was no exception. Instead of releasing the rifle and stepping away, he made a decision that would make the situation much worse. He decided to try to explain his intentions while still holding onto the weapon. "I'm just trying to help him," Marcus said loudly enough for several people nearby to hear. "He looked so tired, and I thought maybe I could hold his rifle for a while so he could rest." The innocent honesty in the boy's voice was unmistakable, but his words only added to the surreal nature of the scene. The crowd's reaction was immediate and intense. Some people laughed nervously at the child's naive explanation, while others looked even more concerned. The idea that a 12-year-old boy had approached a royal guard simply to offer help was both touching and terrifying at the same time. Private Wellington felt a mixture of emotions he had never experienced before. Part of him was touched by the child's innocent concern for his well-being. Another part was terrified about what this incident might mean for his military career. And underneath everything, he was struggling with the practical challenge of how to safely resolve the situation without hurting Marcus or compromising security. More palace security personnel were now approaching the scene. Detective Inspector Sarah Collins, head of palace security, was making her way through the crowd with several other officers. Her experience in handling unusual situations would prove crucial in the next few minutes. Marcus began to realize that his explanation hadn't made things better. The adults around him still looked worried and upset, and more uniformed people were arriving every second. The boy's grip on the rifle began to loosen as genuine fear replaced his earlier determination. "I didn't mean to cause trouble," Marcus said, his voice now shaky with emotion. "I just wanted to help because he looked tired." Tears were beginning to form in his eyes as the reality of the situation started to dawn on him. Sergeant Major Thompson knelt down to Marcus's eye level, a gesture that surprised many of the watching tourists. His weathered face showed understanding rather than anger as he spoke directly to the frightened boy. "I can see that you meant well, son," Thompson said gently. "But these guards have very important jobs, and their rifles are not toys that children can handle. You need to let go of the weapon right now so we can all stay safe." The kindness in Thompson's voice seemed to reach Marcus in a way that commands and orders could not. The boy looked up at Private Wellington, then back at Thompson, and finally began to understand the serious nature of what he had done. Meanwhile, Detective Inspector Collins was coordinating with other security personnel to ensure that the situation remained contained. She was also making mental notes about how this unprecedented incident had occurred and what changes might be needed to prevent similar situations in the future. The crowd of tourists had grown significantly, with people pushing forward to get better views and photographs of the remarkable scene. Palace security was working to maintain order and prevent the situation from becoming even more chaotic. Marcus's hands finally began to loosen their grip on the rifle, but the next few moments would determine whether this incident would end peacefully or escalate into something much more serious. As Marcus slowly began to release his grip on the rifle, something unexpected happened that would change the entire tone of the incident. Private Wellington, who had been trained to maintain strict protocol in all situations, made a decision that went against everything he had been taught about ceremonial guard duty. He looked directly at Marcus and smiled. It wasn't a big smile, and it lasted only a few seconds, but in that moment, Wellington saw past the security breach and the protocol violations. He saw a young boy who had been genuinely trying to help, who had noticed his fatigue and wanted to offer assistance in the only way a child knew how. "Thank you for wanting to help me," Wellington whispered quietly, so only Marcus could hear. "That was very kind of you, but I'm okay. I can handle my duties just fine." Marcus felt his hands completely release the rifle as Wellington's words sank in. The guard wasn't angry with him. In fact, he seemed grateful that someone had cared enough to notice his struggle. This response was completely different from what Marcus had expected after seeing all the serious faces and uniformed officers surrounding them. Sergeant Major Thompson, who had witnessed Wellington's gentle response, made his own decision to handle the situation with understanding rather than strict military discipline. He had seen enough frightened children in his 30 years of service to recognize genuine innocence when he encountered it. "What's your name, son?" Thompson asked Marcus, his voice remaining gentle and encouraging. "Marcus," the boy replied, wiping tears from his eyes with the back of his sleeve. "Marcus Johnson. I live with my grandmother Sarah near here." Thompson nodded thoughtfully. "Well, Marcus Johnson, you've certainly given us all something to remember today. But I need you to understand something very important. These guards and their weapons are here to protect very important people and places. When someone touches a guard's rifle, it sets off alarms and brings lots of security people running, because we have to assume the worst until we know better." Marcus listened intently, finally beginning to understand why his helpful gesture had created such chaos. He looked around at the crowd of tourists, the security officers, and the other guards who were all watching the scene with intense interest. Detective Inspector Collins approached the group and knelt down next to Sergeant Major Thompson. Her presence might have been intimidating, but she had children of her own and recognized the signs of a genuinely confused and frightened child. "Marcus," she said softly, "can you tell me exactly what you were thinking when you decided to touch the guard's rifle?" Marcus took a deep breath and explained his reasoning as clearly as he could. He told them about walking past the palace every morning, about noticing that Private Wellington seemed tired, and about his genuine desire to help by holding the heavy rifle so the guard could rest. As Marcus spoke, something remarkable happened. The adults listening to his explanation began to realize that this incident was not a security threat or a prank gone wrong. It was the result of an extraordinarily empathetic child who had been paying attention to another person's well-being with an intensity that most adults never achieve. Collins exchanged glances with Thompson, both of them recognizing that they were dealing with something unprecedented. In all their years of security work, neither had ever encountered a situation where someone had approached a guard with such genuinely innocent and caring intentions. The crowd of tourists, who had initially been shocked and concerned, began to murmur among themselves about the touching nature of Marcus's explanation. Several people could be heard saying things like, "That's the sweetest thing I've ever heard," and "What a caring little boy." Private Wellington, still maintaining his position but listening to every word, felt a warmth in his chest that he had never experienced while on duty. In all his weeks of standing guard, no one had ever noticed his struggles or shown concern for his well-being. The fact that a child had been paying such careful attention to his condition was both humbling and deeply moving. Thompson stood up and addressed the crowd of tourists who had gathered to witness the unusual scene. "Ladies and gentlemen, what we have here is simply a case of a young boy with a big heart who wanted to help one of our guards. There's no danger and everything is under control." The explanation seemed to satisfy most of the tourists, though many continued taking photographs and discussing the remarkable story they would have to tell when they returned home. Some visitors approached Thompson to express their amazement at Marcus's compassion and concern for the guard's well-being. Collins made a decision that would surprise everyone involved, including herself. Instead of following standard protocol by detaining Marcus for questioning or calling his guardian immediately, she decided to turn this incident into a teaching moment that could benefit everyone. "Marcus," she said, "I want you to meet someone very special." She gestured toward Private Wellington, who was still at his post but clearly listening to every word. "This is Private Wellington, and he's been a Royal Guard for about a month now. Would you like to know what his job really involves?" Marcus nodded eagerly, his fear beginning to be replaced by curiosity and excitement. Collins began to explain the important responsibilities of the Royal Guards, the training they undergo, and the pride they take in protecting the palace and its occupants. As she spoke, Wellington found himself standing a little straighter, feeling proud of his role in a way he hadn't since his first day on the job. The child's concern had reminded him why his service mattered, not just as a job but as a contribution to something larger than himself. Thompson, inspired by Collins's approach, decided to add his own contribution to the impromptu education session. "Marcus, do you know that these guards train for months to learn how to stand perfectly still, hold their rifles correctly, and stay alert even when they're tired?" The boy shook his head, fascinated by this new information. "Private Wellington here," Thompson continued, "has been doing an excellent job, even on days when he's tired. Being tired doesn't mean he can't do his duty properly. It just means he's working hard to serve his country." Marcus looked up at Wellington with new respect and understanding. He was beginning to realize that what he had, interpreted as weakness or need for help, was actually strength and dedication. The incident that had begun with a child's misguided attempt to help was transforming into something beautiful and educational for everyone involved. The tourists watching were witnessing not just an unusual security incident, but a demonstration of compassion, understanding, and the power of good intentions, even when they lead to mistakes. Detective Inspector Collins made an unprecedented decision that would be talked about in security circles for years to come. Instead of ending the incident with standard procedures, she decided to give Marcus and the gathered tourists a brief but genuine insight into the life of a royal guard. "Private Wellington," Collins called out clearly, "with permission, would you be willing to answer a few questions from this young man who is so concerned about your well-being?" Wellington, still maintaining his ceremonial posture, nodded almost imperceptibly. This was highly irregular, but the circumstances were unlike anything covered in his training manual. Collins turned to Marcus. "You can ask Private Wellington one or two questions, but remember that he's still on duty and needs to remain professional." Marcus looked up at Wellington with eyes full of curiosity and newfound respect. His first question came from the heart. "Does your rifle really get heavy when you have to hold it for so long?" Wellington's response was brief but honest. "Yes, it does get heavy, but we train our muscles to handle it. The weight reminds us that we're doing something important." The simple answer satisfied Marcus completely. He finally understood that what he had seen as struggling was actually strength and dedication. His second question showed his growing maturity. "Do you like being a guard even when it's hard?" "Yes," Wellington replied with genuine pride in his voice. "Protecting this place and serving my country makes the difficult parts worth it." The exchange between the young boy and the guard touched everyone present. Tourists who had initially been concerned about a security incident were now witnessing a moment of pure human connection that transcended the formal protocols of palace life. Sergeant Major Thompson, recognizing the educational value of the moment, addressed the crowd. "What you've all witnessed today is something quite special." This young man noticed that one of our guards might be struggling and wanted to help. While his method was incorrect, his heart was in exactly the right place. Thompson then turned to Marcus with a proposal that would surprise everyone. "Marcus, how would you like to learn the proper way to show respect and support for the guards?" The boy nodded eagerly, not sure what Thompson meant, but excited by the possibility. Thompson explained that there was a traditional way for civilians to show appreciation for the guards' service. "You can stand at attention yourself, just like Private Wellington is doing. You can show that you understand the importance of his job by demonstrating your own respect and discipline." Marcus straightened his back and tried to imitate Wellington's posture. His attempt was imperfect but sincere, and the effort clearly moved both Thompson and Collins. The tourists around them began to understand that they were witnessing something remarkable. Many started taking photographs not of the unusual incident, but of the beautiful moment of mutual respect between a child and a soldier. Collins, meanwhile, was thinking about the broader implications of what had happened. In her years of security work, she had seen numerous genuine threats and many false alarms. But never had she encountered someone whose intentions were so purely good, despite their methods being so problematic. She made another decision that would become part of palace legend. Collins asked Wellington if he would be comfortable with Marcus returning occasionally to watch the guards. provided he understood and followed proper boundaries. Wellington's response was immediate and clear. "I would be honored to have such a respectful young observer." Thompson then established some ground rules for Marcus. The boy would be welcome to watch the guards from the designated tourist areas, but he must never again attempt to touch any guard or their equipment. He could show his support through respectful observation and by encouraging other visitors to maintain proper behavior around the guards. Marcus agreed enthusiastically to these conditions. He was beginning to understand that respect and boundaries were not barriers to connection, but rather the foundation for meaningful relationships. As the crowd began to disperse, several tourists approached Marcus to tell him how impressed they were with his caring nature. One elderly woman from Germany said, "You have a beautiful heart, young man. The world needs more people who notice when others are struggling." A businessman from Japan shook Marcus's hand and said, "Your concern for the guard shows great character. Just remember that sometimes the best way to help someone is to trust that they can handle their responsibilities." Private Wellington, still at his post but clearly affected by the morning's events, found himself standing with renewed pride and energy. The knowledge that someone had been watching him with such caring attention made his duties feel more meaningful than they ever had before. Collins took down Marcus's contact information, not for any punitive purpose but because she wanted to follow up with both him and his grandmother. She had a feeling that this incident, properly handled, could become a positive story rather than a security concern. As Marcus prepared to leave for school, he was now very late. Thompson gave him a final piece of advice. "Remember, Marcus, the best way to help someone is often to believe in their strength rather than focusing on their struggles. Private Wellington is strong enough to handle his duties, and your job is to respect that strength." The boy nodded thoughtfully. He was learning lessons about respect, boundaries, service, and the difference between helping and interfering. These were complex concepts for a 12-year-old, but the morning's events had given him real-world experience that would stick with him forever. As Marcus walked away toward school, he turned back once to look at Private Wellington. The guard remained perfectly still, but Marcus could swear he saw a small nod of acknowledgement. Whether real or imagined, it made Marcus feel proud to have learned so much about respect and service. The incident that had begun with a misguided attempt to snatch a rifle had transformed into a lesson about compassion, proper boundaries, and mutual respect. Everyone involved had been changed by the experience in positive ways that would last far beyond that memorable morning. 3 weeks after the incident, Marcus had become something of a local celebrity in his neighborhood. Word had spread about the boy who tried to help a royal guard, and the story had taken on a life of its own. Local newspapers had picked up the tale, describing it as a heartwarming example of childhood compassion and community understanding. Marcus's grandmother, Sarah, had initially been mortified when Detective Inspector Collins called to explain what had happened. But as Collins described the genuine nature of Marcus's intentions and the positive way the situation had been resolved, Sarah found herself feeling proud rather than embarrassed. "I always knew Marcus had a big heart," Sarah told Collins during their phone conversation. "I just never imagined it would lead him to try to help a royal guard. I'm grateful that everyone involved understood he meant no harm." Collins assured Sarah that no charges would be filed and that Marcus was welcome to continue his morning observations of the guards, provided he followed the established guidelines. She also mentioned that the incident had led to some positive discussions about security protocols and community relations. At school, Marcus found his social situation completely transformed. Children who had previously ignored or teased him now wanted to hear the story of his encounter with the royal guard. Teachers treated him with new respect, recognizing that his actions, while misguided, demonstrated remarkable empathy and awareness of others' needs. Mrs. Henderson, his teacher, used Marcus's experience as a starting point for a class discussion about helping others appropriately. "Marcus showed us that noticing when someone might be struggling is important," she explained to the class. "But we also learned that there are right ways and wrong ways to offer help." The lesson resonated with Marcus's classmates, many of whom began paying more attention to people around them who might need assistance. The incident had created a ripple effect of increased awareness and compassion throughout the school. Meanwhile, at the palace, Private Wellington had experienced his own transformation. The knowledge that someone had been watching him with such caring attention had given him a new perspective on his role. He began to see his duty not just as a job, but as a service that connected him to the community he was protecting. Sergeant Major Thompson had used the incident as a training example for other guards, emphasizing the importance of recognizing genuine intent even in inappropriate situations. Sometimes, he told the guards, we need to remember that we serve real people with real feelings, not just abstract concepts of security and protocol. Detective Inspector Collins had written a detailed report about the incident, recommending changes to security protocols that would help identify and appropriately respond to similar situations in the future. Her report emphasized the value of understanding and compassion in security work. The most remarkable development came a month after the incident when Collins contacted Sarah Johnson with an unusual request. The palace administration had been so impressed with the positive outcome of the situation that they wanted to invite Marcus for a special educational visit. We'd like Marcus to meet some of our guards in a more relaxed setting, Collins explained to Sarah. We think he would benefit from learning more about their training and responsibilities, and we believe our guards would benefit from his perspective as well. Sarah was amazed by the invitation, but agreed after discussing it with Marcus. The boy was thrilled at the prospect of learning more about the guards' work and meeting Private Wellington in a setting where they could actually have a conversation. The visit took place on a Saturday morning when tourist crowds were smaller. Marcus arrived at the palace with his grandmother, both of them dressed in their best clothes for the special occasion. Detective Inspector Collins met them at a side entrance and escorted them to a meeting room where several guards, including Private Wellington, were waiting in casual uniforms rather than their ceremonial dress. The atmosphere was relaxed and friendly, completely different from the formal setting where Marcus had first encountered Wellington. "Hello, Marcus," Wellington said with a genuine smile as he stood to greet the boy. "I'm very happy to meet you properly this time." Marcus shook Wellington's hand, feeling a mixture of excitement and nervousness. "I'm sorry I caused so much trouble," he said sincerely. "You didn't cause trouble," Wellington replied. "You showed kindness, and that's never something to apologize for. You just needed to learn the right way to express it." During the visit, Marcus learned fascinating details about the guards' training, their history, and their daily responsibilities. He discovered that the ceremonial duties he observed each morning were only one part of their service, and that many of the guards also served in other military capacities. Sergeant Major Thompson showed Marcus some of the equipment the guards used, including an unloaded replica of the rifle that had been at the center of the incident. Marcus was amazed by its weight and complexity, finally understanding why proper training was so essential. "The rifle isn't just a weapon," Thompson explained. "It's a symbol of the trust the country places in us. When we carry it, we're carrying the responsibility to protect and serve." The guards also shared stories about their experiences, including moments when they had felt tired, cold, or challenged by their duties. Marcus realized that acknowledging these human feelings didn't diminish their professionalism or dedication. Wellington told Marcus about how the incident had affected him personally. "Your concern for me reminded me why this service matters," he said. "Sometimes we get so focused on the rules and procedures that we forget we're part of a community. You helped me remember that." The most moving moment of the visit came when Thompson presented Marcus with a special certificate recognizing his outstanding compassion and community spirit. The certificate noted that while his methods had been inappropriate, his intentions represented the best qualities of citizenship and human caring. As the visit concluded, Collins made a proposal that surprised everyone. She suggested that Marcus might be interested in participating in a new community program the palace was developing, designed to educate young people about service, responsibility, and appropriate ways to support those in uniform. "We think you could help other children understand what you learned," Collins explained. "Your story shows that caring about others is important, but so is learning the right ways to express that care." Marcus was thrilled by the opportunity to help other kids avoid his mistakes, while encouraging them to maintain their compassion for others. The program would allow him to share his experience and the lessons he had learned about respect, boundaries, and service. In the months that followed, Marcus became a regular participant in the palace's educational programs. He would tell his story to visiting school groups, always emphasizing both the importance of caring for others and the need to understand appropriate boundaries and methods of help. Private Wellington continued his service with renewed purpose and energy. The incident with Marcus had taught him that his role connected him to real people, with real concerns, making his duties feel more meaningful than ever before. The story of the boy who tried to help a royal guard became a local legend, but more importantly, it became a teaching tool about compassion, respect, and the proper ways to serve others. Marcus had learned that true caring involves understanding and respecting other people's strength and capabilities, not just focusing on their moments of struggle. Years later, when Marcus was grown and had children of his own, he would still walk past the palace gates occasionally. He would remember the morning when his good intentions had led to an unforgettable lesson about the difference between helping and interfering, between compassion and respect. The incident that had stunned everyone involved had ultimately demonstrated that genuine human kindness, properly channeled and appropriately expressed, could transform a potentially serious security situation into a beautiful example of community understanding and mutual respect. Marcus had learned that the best way to help someone is often to trust in their strength while standing ready to offer appropriate support when truly needed. The royal guards continued their duties with the knowledge that they served a community that cared about their well-being, while that community had learned the importance of expressing care in ways that honored both service and dignity. It was a lesson that benefited everyone involved and created a stronger, more understanding relationship between those who serve and those they protect.